Sergeant Carter stood in the early morning light at Fort Sam Houston, her boots digging into the dusty parade ground. The Texas sun was just beginning to stretch across the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. She adjusted the straps of her pack, feeling the weight of her medical kit pressing against her shoulders. Today was the last day of advanced medic training before deployment, and knew that in less than a week, she'd be thousands of miles from home, in a place where life and death weren't abstract concepts, but constant companions. Had always wanted to save lives. Growing up in a small town in Kansas, she remembered her father's words. Courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about standing still when everyone else is running. It was a philosophy that had guided her through every step of Army life. She excelled in trauma care, memorized protocols, and perfected field triage drills. But when it came to firearms, her heart never pounded with excitement, it pounded with apprehension. Medics don't fight, some of her fellow soldiers had teased, watching her struggle during weapons training. She'd smile politely, shrug off the teasing, and focus on what she knew she was meant to do: heal. Her drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran of 3 deployments, had once barked, "Carter, a medic who can't handle a rifle is a liability," remembered the sting of that comment. But she had learned a quiet truth in her training. Medics were trained in weapons not to enjoy killing, but to protect themselves and their patients if the unthinkable happened. Still, she carried that knowledge like a shadow, an uneasy, unwelcome companion. She wanted to be prepared, but she hoped she'd never have to prove herself in that way. The morning air was cool against her sweat-soaked uniform as she listened to the final instructions for deployment. Orders were being handed out, maps studied, convoys planned. Glanced at the other soldiers, noting their expressions. Some were confident, some anxious, some silently bracing for what was to come. She caught the eye of Staff Sergeant, a man with hardened features and a calm intensity that commanded respect without words. He gave her a nod, a small gesture but one that carried weight. Had always been protective of her, a silent guardian in a world where vulnerability could get you killed. He knew her heart, her moral compass, her unwavering dedication to saving lives. But he also knew the war ahead would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Later that afternoon, walked to the supply tent, her med kit slung across her back, and checked each item meticulously. Bandages, tourniquets, morphine injectors, IV kits, all accounted for. Every piece of equipment represented a life she might touch, a wound she might mend, a soldier she might save. Her mind wandered to the civilians she had trained to help in field exercises. Children with burns, elders with dehydration, villagers caught in crossfire scenarios. She had been trained to respond with precision, speed, and calm, but this was all in controlled environments. Afghanistan would not be controlled. Afghanistan would be chaos. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the base, found herself alone near the perimeter fence. She pulled out her journal, a worn leather notebook she had carried since her first day of medic school. Her pen hovered over the blank page as she whispered to herself, "I'll heal, I'll protect, that's my job, that's who I am." She wrote carefully, pouring her thoughts onto paper. "I don't want to hurt anyone, I want to save. But what if saving means standing between life and death myself? What if my hands have to hold a weapon to protect the people I'm sworn to help? I hope I never have to know that answer." Musings were interrupted by the distant rumble of trucks. The convoy for tomorrow's mission was assembling. She watched the Humvees line up in precise formation, each one a steel promise of survival or destruction. Her heart ached for the men and women who would ride into that uncertain desert, where danger could appear from a rock outcrop or a bend in the dusty road. She knew her role: stay close to the wounded, patch them up, comfort them, and hope that no one ever expected her to fire a shot. Yet a tiny knot of fear twisted in her stomach. Deployment wasn't training. It wasn't drills. It was real. And in real combat, theory often crumbled under the weight of survival. That evening, attended the pre-deployment briefing with her squad. Maps of the region, intelligence reports, and potential ambush points were discussed in meticulous detail. Listened intently, absorbing every word. The instructor highlighted the mountains near the convoy route, nodding insurgent activity and warning of IEDs. Felt the tension in the room tighten like a coiled spring. She glanced at whose face betrayed nothing, yet knew he was calculating risks, forming contingencies, silently preparing for every worst-case scenario. She made a mental note. Trust her training, trust her instincts, trust. Back in her tent, packed her personal items alongside medical supplies. A photograph of her younger brother peeked from her journal, reminding her of why she had chosen this path. Protect life. Save what you can. Come home, she whispered, sealing the notebook carefully. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down, heavier than any pack she had ever carried. Sleep came fitfully, dreams haunted by cries for help she could not yet answer, by visions of explosions, and by the unshakable question, when will I be tested? When will my hands have to hold more than bandages? By dawn, the base was alive with activity. Soldiers loaded weapons, double-checked gear, and climbed into vehicles. Adjusted her straps one final time, feeling the familiar weight of her med kit. She was ready, or as ready as anyone could be. The engines roared and the convoy began to move, kicking up clouds of sand and dust that clung to every surface. Knuckles whitened as she gripped the side of the Humvee. She thought of her oath, of her training, of the faces she hoped to save. And she knew, deep in her bones, that tomorrow might demand something she had never imagined. As the Humvee rumbled over the rough terrain, stared at the horizon, the desert stretching endlessly, indifferent to human courage or fear. The world she had trained for was about to reveal itself in all its raw, unforgiving reality. Somewhere along that path, chaos would descend, choices would be forced, and Carter, the medic who didn't fight, would discover what courage truly meant. The sun had barely risen over the jagged peaks of eastern Afghanistan when Carter's Humvee rolled out of the forward operating base. Dust clung to every surface, coating helmets, rifles, and uniforms in a fine, gritty layer that made the soldiers squint and cough. His heart thumped steadily, not from the heat or the rough terrain, but from the quiet weight of responsibility she carried on her shoulders. Every step forward was another reminder that she wasn't just a medic in training anymore. She was the lifeline for the soldiers she rode alongside. Her eyes scanned the landscape constantly. Rocky cliffs that could conceal an ambush, dry riverbeds perfect for hidden explosives, and scattered villages where civilians watched the convoy pass. Had been briefed thoroughly on insurgent tactics, but nothing in training could fully prepare her for the raw tension of real deployment. She checked her med kit again, fingers grazing the leather straps, silently counting each bandage and injector. It was as if touching them could anchor her in a world that was already spinning on the edge of chaos. Staff Sergeant rode in the vehicle next to her, a silent shadow of experience. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried the weight of decades of combat wisdom. "Stay sharp, Carter. The mountains don't care about rules," he said, eyes scanning the high ridges. Nodded, trying not to betray the small tremor in her hands. Had a way of seeing danger before it appeared, something she both admired and feared. The first hour passed in tense silence. Dust devils swirled across the road, the convoy's engines hummed like nervous insects, and the soldiers exchanged occasional quiet words or glances. Treated minor scrapes and heat blisters as they appeared, her movements calm and precise, even as her mind raced with what-ifs. What if the convoy is hit? What if someone steps on an IED? What if she forced herself to breathe, to slow down her thoughts, focusing instead on the practical? In her world, hesitation could cost lives. A sudden commotion broke her concentration. A young private in the vehicle ahead had become dizzy from the heat and dehydration. Sprang into action, climbing out of her Humvee despite the blistering sun. She moved with practiced efficiency, draping a cooling cloth over the private's neck and offering water. Her hands were steady, her voice soothing. "You're okay. Just breathe. Stay with me." Around her, soldiers shot curious glances but remained focused, treating her patient as if nothing else existed. It was in these small moments, she thought, that courage truly revealed itself, not in firefights or heroics, but in quiet determination to save lives. Hours passed with the convoy winding through narrow canyons and steep inclines. Eyes were constantly on alert, scanning shadows, rocks, and ridges for any sign of movement. The locals they passed occasionally nodded, cautious but curious, waved politely but never let her guard down, noticed her vigilance. "You've got good eyes," he said, his voice low. "Most medics get tunnel vision. You're scanning every angle, that's how we survive." She gave a small smile, though the tension in her shoulders remained. She was grateful for his respect, but terrified of what that vigilance might uncover. By mid-afternoon, the convoy slowed at a small village checkpoint. Local police and elders waved their hands, signaling safe passage, used the pause to check supplies and offer reassurance to nervous soldiers. She moved from Humvee to Humvee, checking water, painkillers, and morale. A soldier muttered a joke, trying to lighten the mood, and forced a laugh, even as her stomach tightened with unease. She knew instinctively that danger was never far, that the quiet moments were often the calm before the storm. The sun climbed higher, baking the canyon walls and casting long, sinister shadows. Thoughts drifted briefly to home, her small Kansas town, her family's modest farmhouse, her younger brother's laughter. Memories of innocence, of simpler days, struck her like a wave. She shook her head, forcing herself back to the present. Here, in the heart of a nostalgia, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every sense had to remain sharp. Every instinct had to serve survival. As the convoy continued, notice subtle signs that didn't appear on any maps or intelligence reports. Rocks shifted unnaturally, small animal trails led to unexpected points, and the wind carried an odd metallic tang. She mentioned it to Quietly, who nodded gravely. "Good eyes, Carter. Keep watching. Sometimes the smallest detail saves the most lives." His compliment was brief but meaningful, felt a surge of determination. She would be ready, whatever came. Then came the first real warning, a faint, muffled sound that didn't belong, a click beneath the dirt, too small to hear without concentration. Froze, heart hammering, and looked around, noticed immediately. "IED," he muttered under his breath. Stomach knotted. This was no longer a drill. The reality of war had arrived, subtle but unmistakable. She adjusted her gloves, tightened her med kit straps, and focused. She was ready to act if anything happened, though fear and adrenaline surged through her like twin currents, threatening to unbalance her calm. Hours passed in tense observation. The convoy pressed on, soldiers exchanging terse whispers, moved through the line, quietly supporting her unit, administering water and checking minor scrapes or heat injuries. Her actions were meticulous, precise, and steady, almost mechanical, but her mind was alive with anticipation. Every shadow, every rock, every fleeting sound seemed like a potential threat. She prayed silently that the day would pass without tragedy, but deep down, she knew her training might soon be tested beyond anything she had imagined. By late afternoon, the convoy neared a narrow pass flanked by steep cliffs. Intelligence reports had warned of ambushes in similar terrain, but this specific location hadn't been flagged. Sensed it immediately, the air felt thick, tense, and unnatural. Her heart raced, noticed her unease, and leaned close. "Eyes sharp, Carter," he murmured. "We may be walking into the teeth of it." Hands tightened around her med kit straps. She whispered to herself, "I'll do my job. I'll save lives. Whatever comes, I'll be ready." The convoy crept forward, dust rising in fine clouds. Gaze flicked to every ridge, every shadow, every crevice. The soldiers around her murmured nervously, the tension palpable. Somewhere in that distance, hidden by rock and wind, danger waited. Stomach knotted as she silently recited her training. Stay calm, assess, react, save lives. Her mind flashed to her family back home, to the oath she had taken as a medic, to heal, to protect, to remain steadfast no matter the cost. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, unaware that within moments that oath would be challenged in ways she had never imagined. The sun dipped lower, casting the valley in long shadows that twisted like dark fingers across the road. Tightened the straps of her med kit one last time and whispered, "I'm ready." She didn't know then that in the next few minutes bullets would whistle past her, lives would hang in the balance, and the medic who never fought would be forced to make a choice she had spent her entire life avoiding. but she was prepared in every way that mattered, mentally, emotionally, and morally, for the storm that was coming. The convoy crept along the dusty canyon road, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Carter's fingers grazed the edges of her med kit nervously, heart hammering with a mix of adrenaline and anticipation. She had spent hours scanning the rocky ridges, noting shadows and subtle movements. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, that made each heartbeat sound deafening. Sat in the vehicle beside her, eyes sweeping the cliffs, muscles coiled and ready. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. Knew he was thinking the same thing: ambush. The lead Humvee rounded a bend in the canyon, and for a fleeting moment the convoy seemed to glide past the danger. Then came the explosion. The roar of fire and metal filled the air. The lead vehicle erupted into a cloud of smoke and flames, tossing soldiers and equipment into the air. Swirled tilted, her stomach dropped, and a high-pitched ringing filled her ears. She froze for a heartbeat, and then instinct took over. "Move, move, move," shouted, leapt from the Humvee, adrenaline driving her forward. The desert dust stung her eyes as she sprinted toward the front of the convoy. Bullets hissed past like angry hornets. The acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke made it hard to breathe. Around her, soldiers were shouting, crawling, diving for cover, and returning fire. Chaos had descended in an instant. Mind narrowed, each second stretching into eternity. She could feel the lives of her comrades hanging in the balance. She reached a wounded private sprawled across the dusty road. Blood seeped through his uniform, his face pale and contorted with pain. Dropped to her knees, her hands moving with precise, practiced efficiency. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din. She ripped open his shirt, applied a tourniquet, and injected morphine, her fingers trembling slightly from fear and adrenaline. Around her, the world was a cacophony of screams, gunfire, and rolling explosions. Yet in that moment her focus was absolute, one life at a time. A sudden grenade landed just a few feet away, tossing dirt and shrapnel into the air. Dove over the private instinctively, shielding him with her body. Pain lanced through her arm as shrapnel tore at her sleeve, embedding itself in her skin. She gritted her teeth, suppressing a scream, and rolled to a safer position, dragging the private with her. The explosion left a cloud of dust in its wake and coughed violently, dust filling her lungs. But there was no time to dwell on pain. The enemy was closing in. Bullets ricocheted off rocks and insurgents appeared from the cliffs above, firing with deadly accuracy. The Humvee gunner ahead had been hit and the vehicle stalled, wheels spinning helplessly in the sand. Mind raced. She was trained to heal, to patch wounds, to stabilize, not to kill. And yet the rifle lying next to her seemed to call out in the chaos, a silent, desperate plea. Shouted, "Carter, grab a weapon, cover us." Froze, the weight of the decision crashing down on her. Every fiber of her being screamed against it. "I'm a medic. I'm not a fighter." And yet the cries of the wounded drowned out her hesitation. She reached for the rifle, hands shaking violently. The cold metal felt foreign, heavy with responsibility. Eyes met hers, a silent encouragement and warning. "Do it, protect them," he yelled, gritted her teeth, pulling herself behind a large boulder for cover. The insurgents advanced, unaware that the medic had armed herself. She took a deep breath, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her, but the insurgent fell. A surge of shock and disbelief coursed through her veins. She had fired. She had acted. She had crossed a line she had never imagined approaching. Didn't pause. The chaos demanded constant action. Between bursts of gunfire, she returned to the wounded, applying tourniquets, bandaging deep lacerations, and injecting morphine where needed. Covered her flanks, shouting orders and laying down suppressive fire. The rest of the platoon regrouped, inspired by her courage and tenacity. For the first time, felt the terrifying clarity of war. Life and death were no longer abstract principles. They were in her hands. Every decision mattered. Every action could save a life or condemn it. Minutes felt like hours as the firefight raged on, moved with grim determination, alternating between healing and firing. The insurgents began to retreat, surprised by the medic's unexpected ferocity and skill. Shouted, "Hold the line. Air support is inbound." The distant hum of approaching helicopters was a promise of salvation. Took a moment to steady her breathing, her hands shaking as she checked the soldiers around her. Some were injured, some were exhausted, but none were lost, not yet. As the first helicopters appeared on the horizon, lowered her rifle for a moment, surveying the aftermath. Bodies sprawled, dust hung thick in the canyon, and smoke rose from the lead Humvee. She felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that her comrades would survive, sorrow for the injuries, for the destruction, and for the undeniable truth she had just faced. Sometimes saving lives meant fighting. Knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Carter," he said quietly. "You saved them all." Nodded, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, unsure if they were from exhaustion, adrenaline, or the weight of what she had just done. The helicopters landed, soldiers were loaded for evacuation, and the insurgents had fled into the desert ridges. Checked her med kit one final time, ensuring everyone wounded had been treated. Her uniform was streaked with blood, not hers alone, and her arm throbbed where shrapnel had cut through. She had crossed the line from medic to soldier, from healer to protector in a way she had never imagined. And yet, she felt no pride. Only a solemn understanding that courage was not about choice. It was about necessity. As the convoy began to move again, sat silently in the Humvee, med kit in her lap, rifle resting across her knees. Gave her a small, approving nod. "Guess medics fight after all," he said, a wry smile on his face. Allowed herself a faint smile in return, her mind still racing from the battle. The canyon that had threatened to swallow them alive now seemed eerily calm, the wind carrying the faint smell of smoke and sand. She knew the war was far from over, and yet, for the first time, she understood the meaning of her oath. To save lives at any cost, even if it meant stepping into a role she had never sought. That night, as the sun set behind jagged mountains and the stars appeared one by one, wrote in her journal, her hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Today I learned that courage is not always a choice. Sometimes it is the only way to survive. I am a medic. I am a soldier. And today I fought and I healed." She closed the journal, resting her head against the Humvee, knowing that tomorrow the war would demand even more from her. The dust hadn't yet settled from the ambush when Carter realized that survival had only just begun. The enemy had retreated temporarily, but the silence that followed was as dangerous as the gunfire that had erupted minutes before. Her arm throbbed from the shrapnel wound she had sustained, a dull, constant ache that she ignored. Every sense in her body was on high alert. She scanned the rocky cliffs and canyon edges, eyes straining to spot any sign of insurgent movement. Somewhere out there, they were waiting for mistakes, and mistakes could be fatal. Dropped to one knee behind a fractured boulder, her med kit beside her and her fingers hovering over her rifle. The hum of engines in the distance signaled approaching reinforcements, but she knew it would take minutes that could be the difference between life and death for the soldiers still exposed. Around her, the platoon regrouped, injured soldiers clutching bandages, their eyes wide and searching. She moved between them like a shadow, assessing wounds, applying quick tourniquets, and offering calm words in a storm of fear. "Stay with me," she whispered to a private whose leg was bleeding profusely. Her voice was steady, though her mind screamed with tension. A sudden crack echoed from the ridge above. Bullets ricocheted off rocks, showering sand in sharp, stinging bursts. Eyes widened as she realized that the insurgents had flanked them, circling back from higher ground. The Humvee gunner ahead had been hit, leaving no cover for the soldiers who had been pinned down. Instinct screamed at her, "Protect them, even if it means stepping into the fight." Her fingers brushed the rifle again, the cold metal a shocking reminder of the responsibility she now bore. She didn't want to fight. She wanted to heal. But as the screams of the wounded filled the canyon, hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. "Medic," barked from a few feet away, firing bursts at the advancing enemy. "We're exposed, cover us." Hands shook and she took a deep breath. Every training drill, every lesson in her mind led to this moment. She gripped the rifle tightly, aiming at the shadowy figures darting between rocks. Her heart pounded violently against her, but she steadied herself. The first shot rang out, precise and deliberate. One insurgent fell, and a ripple of shock passed through the remaining attackers. His mind split between two worlds, healer and warrior, as she fired again, then returned to her med kit to stabilize a soldier whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. The clash of survival and morality tore at her. Had sworn an oath to save lives, not take them, yet in this moment, saving lives required both. The canyon erupted in a deadly dance of fire and motion. Soldiers firing, bullets whistling, explosions scattering dust like deadly snow. Moved fluidly between treating wounds and returning fire, her body a conduit of focus and fear. She felt a jolt of panic when a round grazed the boulder beside her, showering sparks and dust. But she couldn't stop. Lives depended on her courage and her choices, each second an agonizing calculation. A grenade landed perilously close. Reflexes kicked in. She dove over a wounded private, shielding him with her body. The explosion tore through the air, shrapnel embedding in her arm and thigh. Pain exploded in sharp, hot bursts, yet she forced herself to stay conscious, rolling behind a larger boulder for protection. Around her, the platoon scrambled, some returning fire, others ducking and yelling commands. His breath came in ragged bursts, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been. The medic was no longer just a healer. She was a defender, standing between life and annihilation. From her vantage point, could see insurgents attempting to circle the exposed flanks. Shouted, calling coordinates for suppressive fire. Realized she couldn't just wait. She had to act to protect the wounded and buy time. She peeked around her cover, firing in short, controlled bursts. Each shot was measured, precise, and deliberate. Her heart pounded, but a calm determination settled over her, a clarity that came only when survival demanded every ounce of skill, courage, and instinct. She wasn't killing recklessly. She was saving lives, one agonizing decision at a time. Minutes stretched like hours as the firefight escalated. Hands were slick with sweat and blood, her own and the wounded around her. Every time she moved, sand and debris stung her eyes, but she pressed on, tending to injuries while returning fire. Covered her flank, occasionally shouting guidance or encouragement. "Keep your head, Carter. Don't stop. They're counting on us." She nodded, almost wordlessly, as she dragged another injured soldier to relative safety and checked his pulse. "You're gonna make it," she muttered, administering morphine with one hand and gripping the rifle with the other. The sun climbed high in the sky, beating down mercilessly, yet its focus remained absolute. She was a machine of necessity, alternating between fire and healing. She spotted an insurgent trying to flank her squad from the ridge above and fired, the recoil jolting her shoulder. Shouted approval, and a small, grim sense of relief washed over her. She had taken action, confronted the enemy, and protected those in her care. Yet the moral weight pressed on her chest like a boulder. Every shot, every choice, a reminder that the line between life and death had blurred irreversibly. As the minutes dragged on, noticed the first signs of the insurgents retreating. Air support was still minutes away, but the immediate threat began to waver. She checked the soldiers around her, treating injuries, reassuring panicked breaths, and applying makeshift bandages where needed. Sweat and dust clung to her skin. Blood streaked her uniform, a visceral map of the chaos. And yet, in that moment of exhaustion and terror, felt a strange, fierce clarity. She had crossed a line she never wanted to cross, but she had done it in the service of life. Finally, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors reached their ears. Allowed herself a brief glance skyward. Air support meant extraction, medical attention, and a temporary reprieve from the relentless threat. She checked her kit one last time, ensuring every wounded soldier was accounted for and stabilized. Her arm throbbed with pain, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the broader picture. The platoon had survived, the wounded had a chance, and she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Leaned close, voice low and calm despite the chaos around them. "You did it, Carter. You held the line." Shoulders sagged, fatigue and relief intertwining. She lowered her rifle slowly, scanning the canyon one last time. The threat had not vanished entirely, but she had done her job more than her job. She had fought, healed, and survived. Her journal from that morning flashed in her mind, the words she had written now echoing with new meaning. Courage is not always a choice. Sometimes it is the only way to survive. As helicopters touched down, helped guide her platoon and the injured toward extraction. The valley was quiet now, dust settling like an uneasy blanket over the landscape. The medic who never fought had become a warrior in her own right. She allowed herself a small, fleeting thought. Perhaps courage was not defined by whether one carried a weapon, but by the willingness to act, to protect, and to endure, even when fear demanded retreat. And as the first wave of medevac helicopters lifted off, clutched her med kit and whispered quietly, almost to herself, "I'm still a healer, but today I fought for them." The valley was alive with the echo of gunfire, screams, and the acrid scent of smoke. Carter crouched behind a jagged boulder, her med kit still slung across her shoulder, a rifle trembling in her hands. The transition from medic to defender had come abruptly, almost violently. She wasn't trained to enjoy firing a weapon, and yet in this moment she understood its necessity. Each pull of the trigger was a choice between chaos and protection. The insurgents were relentless, and every second she hesitated could cost a life. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she aimed, fired, and adjusted. His hands were slick with sweat and blood, both her own and that of the soldiers she had pulled to relative safety. Her mind calculated trajectories, cover, and timing, even as her chest burned with exertion. The first insurgent had fallen earlier, a jolt of shock and disbelief passing through her. But the battle was far from over, shouted from the flank, directing soldiers and coordinating positions. "Carter, cover fire on the ridge." His words were urgent but calm, a lifeline in the madness. Adjusted her stance, peering over the edge of the boulder, and fired another short, controlled burst. Another insurgent dropped, and she felt the strange, conflicting mix of fear and clarity that came with active combat. Between bursts of gunfire, she scanned her surroundings for the wounded. The soldiers who had survived the initial ambush were battered, their morale frayed but not broken, moved swiftly, almost instinctively, tending to minor injuries, applying tourniquets and offering soothing words. "You're going to make it. Stay with me," she whispered repeatedly, her voice calm and measured despite the chaos. It was a delicate balancing act. Protect the living while defending against those who sought to end them. Each action was a test of endurance, skill, and morality. A sudden movement on the ridge caught Si's eye. A figure attempted to flank the platoon from behind. Her finger tightened on the trigger and she fired with precision. The insurgent dropped. Noticing the maneuver, barked encouragement over the roar of gunfire. "Nice shot, Carter, keep them pinned." She allowed herself a brief nod of acknowledgement, but her mind didn't dwell on the kill. There was no time for pride. There was only survival, healing, and the endless rhythm of action and reaction. The platoon began to push forward slowly, using the cover and provided to gain a tactical advantage, alternated between providing suppressive fire and administering aid. She moved fluidly, weaving between soldiers and rocks, her actions synchronized with adrenaline and necessity. Each time she treated a wounded comrade, she felt the weight of her responsibility deepen. She realized that the rifle in her hands was not a tool of aggression, but of protection, a way to ensure that the lives she swore to save had the chance to continue. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. His body ached, her arms burned, her throat was raw from shouting, and her lungs screamed from exertion. Sweat and blood mingled on her skin, the heat of the desert oppressive. Yet through every pang of exhaustion, she felt a quiet determination that anchored her. She had crossed a line she never intended to cross, but she had done so for the sake of life. She was no longer merely a medic, she was a guardian. She had drawn the line between helplessness and action, between fear and courage. At one point, crouched beside a young private whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. Her hands moved quickly, applying a tourniquet while scanning the canyon for incoming threats. "You're going to be okay. I've got you," she whispered, injecting morphine to dull the excruciating pain. The private's eyes fluttered shut, a faint sigh escaping his lips. Allowed herself a heartbeat of relief, then picked up her rifle again. The insurgents were still advancing, still relentless. She fired again, Each shot deliberate, controlled, a shield for those around her. Shouted air support inbound, hold your positions. Allowed herself a brief glance toward the distant horizon. The sound of approaching helicopters was a promise of safety, but the immediate danger remained. She continued moving between wounded soldiers and strategic cover, her mind operating on instinct and training. Each decision she made was weighted with consequence. Which soldier to tend to first, when to fire, when to retreat, when to advance. She felt a grim clarity settle over her. Courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was action, measured and unflinching in the face of unimaginable stakes. A second wave of insurgents attempted to circle from the east, seeking to exploit gaps in the platoon's line. Rose from cover, firing precise shots that forced the attackers to retreat momentarily. Her chest heaved and she could feel her pulse in her temples, but she remained focused. Leaned close, shouting guidance. Carter, take the ridge, cover fire for Bravo, nodded, moving with determination. The canyon had become a deadly chessboard, and she was playing her part with a skill she had never imagined she possessed. Finally, the helicopters arrived, descending through the dusty haze, helped guide the wounded toward extraction points, checking vitals and applying last-minute stabilizations. She was exhausted, bloodied, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Yet through the exhaustion ran a fierce sense of accomplishment. She had done more than survive. She had protected, healed, and fought. She had drawn a line she never thought she would, and in doing so had upheld the oath she had taken as a medic. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying soldiers and the severely wounded to safety, allowed herself a moment of reflection. The battlefield was littered with debris and smoke, yet the platoon had survived. She looked down at her hands, smeared with blood and dirt, and whispered almost to herself, "I didn't kill to take life. I fought to save it," approached, clapping her shoulder gently. "You've got a hell of a way of holding the line, Carter. Proud of you." She nodded, swallowing back a mixture of exhaustion, pride, and lingering disbelief. That night, as the valley returned to an uneasy calm, sat with her journal, hands trembling but pen steady. She wrote about the day's events, the choices she had made, and the terrifying clarity she had gained. "I have learned that courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by action in its presence. Today, I drew a line I never expected to cross. Today, I fought not for glory, but to protect life. And today, I healed and defended with everything I had." Closing her journal, felt a quiet sense of resolve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she now understood something essential. Bravery could be messy, terrifying, and morally complex, but it was always worth it when lives depended on it. The canyon, bathed in the pale light of evening, was silent now except for the distant hum of departing helicopters. Carter, medic and reluctant fighter, finally allowed herself to breathe. She had crossed the line between healer and soldier, and in doing so had discovered a courage that would remain with her long after the war ended. She wasn't proud of the violence she had engaged in, but she was profoundly aware of the lives she had preserved. And for a combat medic, that was everything. The air in the valley was heavy with dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. Carter sat slumped against the side of the Humvee, her uniform torn and streaked, her hands still trembling from the chaos that had erupted hours earlier. The ambush was over, but the aftermath was suffocating in its intensity. Every sound, a creaking metal panel, the distant clatter of debris, the faint hum of a helicopter fatting into the horizon, reminded her that survival was only the first step. Lives had been saved, yes, but at what cost? His arms throbbed with lingering pain from the shrapnel wounds she had barely tended to herself. Sweat and dust caked her skin, her throat was raw from shouting, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the battle was finally ebbing, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. She flexed her fingers, flexing against the stiffness, and looked at the soldiers around her. Some were still stunned, eyes wide with disbelief, others quietly tending to minor injuries or checking equipment. All had survived for now, but the terror in their eyes mirrored her own. Crouched beside her, wiping blood from a private's forehead, he gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than words ever could. "You did it, Carter," he said softly. "We're alive because of you. shook her head slightly, incredulous. Alive, yes, but the canyon still bore the marks of devastation. Humvees were damaged, gear scattered, and dust-covered bodies of both friend and foe lay in the sand. The quiet aftermath of violence felt surreal, almost like a dream that refused to let go. Forced herself to check her med kit, moving methodically even as her body begged for rest. She tended to the wounded with practiced precision, adjusting tourniquets, applying morphine, and stabilizing anyone who could be moved safely. Every motion was automatic, almost ritualistic, as though her training demanded that her focus remain on others before herself. She ignored the throbbing in her arm and the sharp sting of shrapnel in her leg, knowing that if she slowed down, someone else might suffer. For exhaustion had no place in the field. One soldier caught her attention, a young private she had helped during the initial ambush. His eyes were haunted, fingers shaking as he traced over a bandaged leg, knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You made it through," she said quietly. "You're safe now." He blinked, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over his features. "Thanks, Sergeant." His words faltered, gave him a faint, reassuring smile. "No thanks needed, just stay alive, that's what matters." As the sun began to dip behind the canyon walls, allowed herself a rare moment to breathe, her head resting lightly against the Humvee. Memories of the ambush replayed in her mind, the flash of explosions, the screams of the wounded, the crack of rifles, the fleeting sight of death around every corner. She tried to compartmentalize, to focus only on what remained to be done, but the images clung stubbornly, refusing to be ignored. For the first time, understood the invisible weight carried by those who survived such chaos, the heavy shadow of what they had witnessed, the knowledge that they had been mere inches from death. Called the remaining soldiers together, organizing them for extraction and vehicle repair. Moved among them, offering guidance and reassurance, her voice calm but firm. Even in her exhaustion, she maintained her role as both leader and healer. The injured were loaded onto Humvees, and the convoy slowly began to move again, limping along the rough terrain toward the safety of the forward operating base. His body ached, but her mind remained alert, scanning the cliffs and canyons for any sign of a renewed attack. The valley that had been the site of terror earlier now seemed deceptively quiet, its silence both a relief and a warning. During a rare moment of calm, pulled her journal from her pack. Hands still shaking, she wrote about the events of the day, each word a small attempt to process the chaos. "Today, I learned that courage is not defined by choice. It is defined by necessity. I was a healer, but I became a protector. I fought not to kill, but to save. Every life I touched reminded me why I am here, and yet the cost of survival is etched into every corner of my mind." Writing these words brought a strange comfort, a fragile anchor in a storm that refused to end. The convoy reached a small plateau where temporary shelter had been set up, helped unload injured soldiers, ensuring that each was stabilized before moving to the next. The medevac helicopters had long departed, leaving only the echoes of rotors in the distance. Soldiers leaned against vehicles, bandaging wounds, offering water, and exchanging whispered words of disbelief. Moved among them like a quiet force of calm, her presence steadying those who had been rattled by the chaos. Evening descended, painting the valley in muted golds and reds. Finally found a quiet corner to rest, leaning against a Humvee and closing her eyes. The adrenaline that had carried her through the firefight had ebbed, leaving fatigue and pain in its place. Memories of the fallen soldiers flashed through her mind, faces she had seen only briefly yet would never forget. She whispered a silent prayer for them, acknowledging the cost of the battle and the weight of her survival. As night fell, gazed up at the stars emerging over the jagged peaks. The sky seemed impossibly vast, indifferent to human struggle, yet strangely comforting. She allowed herself a deep, steadying breath, feeling the rhythm of life in the quiet night. She was exhausted, battered, and forever changed, but she was alive. And she had saved lives. That realization, fragile yet profound, was enough to anchor her amidst the lingering tremors of fear and uncertainty. Before finally surrendering to exhaustion, opened her journal once more. She wrote with careful deliberation, The battle is over, but the weight remains. I am tired and uncertain about what comes next. Yet I know this: I fought not for glory, but to protect life. I healed not for recognition, but because it was my duty. I am a medic. I am a protector. And today I endured. She closed the journal, placing it carefully in her pack, and allowed herself the briefest moment of rest, the cool night air carrying both the scent of sand and a fragile promise of survival. In the stillness of the night, Carter understood something essential. Courage was not measured by medals, accolades, or public recognition. Courage was measured in action, in the willingness to face fear, to stand between life and death, and to make choices that few could bear to make. She had done that today, and though the wounds were real, the memories haunting, and the scars permanent, she knew she had fulfilled her oath. She had healed, she had protected, and she had survived. Weeks had passed since the ambush in the canyon, and the forward operating base was finally settling into a fragile rhythm of relative calm. Carter moved among her fellow soldiers with quiet efficiency, tending to wounds, administering routine care, and offering words of reassurance. Yet beneath the surface, a storm of memories, questions, and lingering fear haunted her every step. The battle in the canyon had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had survived, she had saved lives, and she had fired her rifle, crossing a line she had never imagined, and one that would never be erased. Her hands still bore the faint scars of shrapnel wounds, the physical reminders of that day. More haunting, however, were the mental images, the screams, the flash of explosions, the faces of the wounded and the fallen. At night, she replayed the battle in vivid detail, questioning every decision she had made, wondering if she could have done more. Noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes sometimes drifted toward a ridge, as if expecting an ambush that would never come. One evening, he approached her quietly. "You did everything right, Carter," he said softly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know if you realize it, but you kept everyone alive. You didn't just fight, you saved lives, and that's far harder than any firefight." Shook her head, refusing to meet his gaze. "I had to fight," she whispered. "I'm not a soldier, I'm a medic. I shouldn't have." Her voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Gave a small, understanding nod. Sometimes the line between medic and soldier disappears. Courage isn't about rules, Carter. It's about action when the moment demands it. You acted. Days later was called to the base command center. Nervous, she entered to find the commanding officer waiting, a folder in hand. Soldiers she knew from the ambushed convoy were lined up nearby, some with subtle nods of respect. Her stomach twisted with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The officer's stern gaze softened slightly as he addressed her. "Sergeant Carter, your actions during the ambush on the 14th saved countless lives. Your bravery under fire, your quick thinking, and your ability to protect and treat the wounded have earned you the recognition of your superiors and your peers." His heart raced. Recognition had never been her goal. She had acted because she had to, because lives depended on it. Medals, accolades, and praise were foreign concepts to her. She glanced at the folder, unsure of what to expect. The officer continued, "For your extraordinary courage and dedication, you are being awarded the Bronze Star with Valor. It is the Army's acknowledgement of your heroism." The words hung in the air, weighty and surreal. Felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of disbelief, humility, and quiet pride. During the ceremony that evening, stood in formation, her uniform immaculate despite the dust and scars from deployment. The award was pinned to her chest by a superior officer, the gleam of the medal catching the fading sunlight. Around her, fellow soldiers watched with quiet reverence. Gave her a small, approving nod from the crowd. Accepted the recognition with silent dignity, bowing her head, but inside she felt conflicted. The medal was a symbol of her courage, yet it also represented the horrors she had witnessed, the lives she had fought to save, and the moments she could never forget. After the ceremony, retreated to a quiet corner of the base. She opened her journal, her hands trembling slightly. Writing had always been a refuge, a way to process the weight of her experiences. "I have a medal," she wrote, "a symbol of courage and survival, but it is not a trophy. It is a reminder of the lives I saved, the lives I could not, and the line I crossed between healer and fighter. I am proud, but I am changed, and I am still learning what it means to carry both roles. That night sleep came fitfully, dreamt of the canyon, the ambush, the screams, and the flashes of gunfire. In her dreams, the soldiers she had saved called out to her, their voices a mixture of gratitude and fear. She awoke with a start, chest heaving, heart pounding. The trauma of the battlefield was not something that vanished with medals or recognition. It was a quiet, persistent presence, shaping her thoughts and shadowing her moments of calm. In the days that followed, noticed subtle changes in herself. She was more alert, scanning her surroundings instinctively, sometimes imagining threats that were no longer there. She found herself reflecting constantly on decisions made during the ambush, what she could have done differently, who she had saved, and what might have been lost. The soldier who had survived the closest grenade blast, the private whose leg she had stabilized, the young sergeant who had fought alongside her, their faces replayed in her mind in vivid detail. She realized that survival came with a price, memory and conscience. One evening found her sitting alone under a star-filled sky. She stared at the horizon, lost in thought. "You're thinking about them," he said quietly, nodded, her voice barely audible. "I keep seeing them, the ones we couldn't save, the ones I had to fight for, the ones I couldn't reach in time." Sat beside her, offering silent comfort. "Those memories never leave, and that's okay. It means you care, it means you're human, but don't let them define you. Let them guide you. Every life you saved, that's real. That matters." Exhaled slowly, letting the weight of his words settle. In quiet moments, she returned to her journal. She reflected not just on the battle, but on the transformation she had. "I am a medic. I'm a soldier. I'm a healer who fought, a protector who healed. I have seen the worst of humanity, but I have also seen courage, resilience, and hope. This medal is not for me alone. It is for every life I touched, every soldier I held in my hands, every person who survived because I acted." Closing the journal, felt a fragile sense of peace. The trauma of battle was not gone, but she had learned to carry it with purpose rather than letting it crush her. As weeks turned into months, continued her deployment, performing her duties with unwavering dedication. She treated the injured, comforted the fearful, and occasionally fired her rifle when circumstances demanded. The battlefield had changed her, forged a new understanding of courage, responsibility, and moral complexity. She no longer questioned whether she could act under pressure. She knew she could. And while the memories of fire, blood, and dust would follow her always, she carried them as lessons rather than chains. The bronze star on her chest gleamed in the sun, a visible reminder of courage under fire, but more importantly, carried an invisible medal in her heart, the knowledge that she had faced fear, acted decisively, and saved lives. Her story, etched in scars, memories, and journal pages, would remain with her long after the battlefield faded from view. And in that knowledge, she found a quiet strength that would guide her through every challenge yet to come. The roar of the plane's engines filled Carter's ears as she stared out the small oval window, watching the endless desert fade beneath her. The deployment had ended, and she was finally on her way home. After months of sand, blood, and chaos, the thought of returning to familiar streets, family, and quiet nights seemed almost unreal. The bronze star with valor rested in her duffel bag, a reminder of courage, loss, and survival. Yet as she stared at the horizon, felt a twinge of apprehension. Returning home would not erase what she had experienced. The battlefield had changed her. Her mind replayed the ambush in the canyon like a persistent echo. Dust, shrapnel, screams, and the sudden weight of responsibility haunted her every thought. Had been a medic, trained to save lives, but she had become a protector, a fighter, a soldier. She had held the line when others couldn't, and that line had forever blurred the distinction between healer and combatant. Her hands still shook occasionally, especially when she tried to sleep, and vivid memories came unbidden, a reminder that bravery had a cost. Landing at the airport was met by the familiar sights and sounds of home. Cars honked, travelers bustled, and the air smelled sweet with humidity and the faint aroma of blooming trees. She took a deep breath, allowing the familiar environment to calm her racing thoughts. Family and friends were waiting, faces bright with relief and concern. Her mother rushed forward, tears streaming, enveloping in a tight embrace. "You're home," her mother whispered, voice breaking. Closed her eyes, holding on to the warmth and safety she hadn't felt in months. Home, fragile, ordinary, yet profoundly healing. Even as she was surrounded by love, knew she carried invisible burdens. Memories of the canyon, the screams, the blood, and the lives she had saved or lost remained etched into her mind. She spoke little at first, smiling faintly when asked about her deployment but avoiding the full weight of the stories. At night, she found herself replaying decisions, questioning whether she had done enough, whether she could have acted differently. Trauma was not something easily left behind. It clung, quiet yet persistent, reminding her of the fragility of life. Days turned into weeks and began to reintroduce herself to the rhythms of civilian life. She walked familiar streets, visited old friends, and even returned to the small where she used to spend afternoons reading and journaling. The normalcy was comforting, yet at times suffocating. Loud noises startled her, and shadows occasionally triggered flashes of memory. But gradually, she learned to reconcile her past with her present. Each act of ordinary living, cooking dinner, reading a book, laughing with friends, became a quiet act of reclaiming her life. Returned to her volunteer work with veterans and local first responders, offering medical support, guidance, and mentorship. Her experiences in the canyon had given her insight into both physical and psychological wounds. She spoke openly about resilience, courage, and the importance of facing fear, though she carefully navigated discussions of her own trauma. Sharing her story helped others heal, and in return, she found solace and purpose. The battlefield may have taken much from her, but it had also given her a unique perspective and an unshakable resolve. One evening, visited a quiet memorial in her, a small park adorned with flags and plaques honoring soldiers who had served. She lingered, thinking of the canyon, of the soldiers she had fought alongside, and of the ones who had not survived. She placed her hand on the bronze plaque, a silent promise to remember them, to honor their sacrifice, and to continue living in a way that would make their courage meaningful. Tears came unbidden, but she welcomed them. Remembering did not mean being broken. It meant carrying the past with dignity and strength. Her journal, now thick with months of reflection, remained a constant companion. Often wrote late into the night, documenting dreams, memories, and emotions, translating chaos into words, trauma into understanding. "I am home," she wrote one evening, "but the canyon remains in my mind. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in its presence. I am a healer, a protector, and a survivor. Life continues, and I will honor it not by forgetting, but by remembering with purpose and grace." The act of writing became a ritual of healing, a way to reconcile the person she had been with the person she had become. Family noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She smiled more readily now, laughed freely, and engaged with life in a way that seemed lighter than before. Yet there was a depth to her gaze, a quiet intensity that spoke of experiences no one else could fully understand. Friends and neighbors recognized her courage, sometimes asking about her medal or deployment, and she shared what she could without embellishment. Each conversation was a balancing act, a chance to educate, inspire, and honor without reliving trauma unnecessarily. Months later, returned to the local high school where she had once studied, giving a talk about courage, resilience, and the importance of service. She spoke not only as a soldier and medic, but as someone who had faced fear head-on and survived. Students listened intently, eyes wide with admiration and curiosity. Words were honest, reflecting both the horrors of war and the strength required to endure it. "Courage isn't just about fighting," she said softly. "It's about protecting, healing, and doing what's necessary when lives depend on you. Sometimes, courage looks like a medic picking up a rifle. Sometimes, it looks like a nurse holding a hand through the night. And sometimes, it looks like coming home and living fully, despite what you've seen." Standing there, realized that her journey had come full circle. The canyon had tested her body, mind, and spirit. She had crossed lines she never imagined, faced fear she never wanted to know, and survived battles that would forever shape her. Yet she had also returned home, intact, determined, and ready to live. She understood that courage was ongoing, not confined to the battlefield, and that the measure of her strength would be seen in the ordinary moments she now cherished, in her family, her friends, and her community. As she walked home that evening, the setting sun casting warm light across familiar streets, felt a quiet sense of peace. The canyon, the ambush, and the chaos remained in her memory, but they no longer dominated her life. She had survived, saved lives, and learned the deepest truths about courage, resilience, and the human spirit. Her bronze star hung quietly in her home, a symbol of the extraordinary circumstances she had endured. But her greatest reward was the life she continued to live, intentional, courageous, and deeply human. In the quiet of her room that night, opened her journal one last time. She wrote, "I returned home carrying scars and memories, courage and doubt, sorrow and hope. I fought, I healed, I survived. And now I live fully, intentionally, and gratefully. The canyon will always be a part of me, but it does not define me. I am more than the battles I have faced. I am life, love, and courage in action." Closing the journal, she smiled softly. For the first time in months, Carter allowed herself to feel whole, knowing that home was not just a place, but a state of being she had fought to reclaim, and one she would never take for granted.